Imagine a quiet morning in a small Vietnamese village. Women are cooking rice, children are running barefoot, elders sit at the entrances to their huts. Everything seems routine until soldiers in helmets appear on the horizon. Their footsteps and shouts break the familiar rhythm of life, and at some point this entire world collapses. This is how the tragedy known to history as the My Lai massacre began. It became one of the darkest episodes of the Vietnam War, the moment when the illusion of a just war crumbled and a truth long averted burst into the open. On March 16, 1968, the U.S. Army's Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. According to command reports, Viet Cong fighters were allegedly there, but in fact most men had gone to the fields, and women, children, and the elderly remained in the village. The soldiers were worn down by the war, ambushes, mines, comrades killed with no chance for revenge. They were told to destroy the enemy and to show results and reports where success was measured by the number of dead. In an atmosphere of fear and hatred, any resident could be seen as an enemy. What began as a military operation quickly turned into a systematic massacre. Residents were shot, houses burned, livestock destroyed. Within a few hours, between 300 and 500 people were killed, according to various estimates. These events did not become known to the world immediately. Official reports stated 128 enemy killed. For the command, this was a successful operation. But there were those who could not accept it. Army helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, seeing what was happening, landed his machine between the soldiers and the villagers and ordered his crew to open fire on their own if they tried to continue the killings. He saved several dozen people and later testified, becoming a rare example of courage and conscience against a backdrop of silence. When the truth began to leak out, America was shaken by a wave of shock. In 1969, journalist Seymour Hersh published an investigation, and photographs taken that day by Army photographer Ron Heberl showed that the enemies in the pictures were children and women. These images spread across newspapers and magazines worldwide. The trial of Lieutenant William Calley became the only major case. He was found guilty of the murder of 22 villagers and sentenced to life imprisonment, but within a few years he was free. Other officers and soldiers avoided punishment, which only deepened public distrust and anger. The My Lai massacre became a symbol of the war's brutality and a turning point in Americans' perception of Vietnam. Millions who had recently believed in the nobility of the mission saw that the war was being waged at the cost of unarmed lives. For Vietnam, this was only one of many similar episodes, but this case received global publicity. It became a lesson that war turns enemies and civilians into one gray mass, and a reminder that control and accountability are necessary, otherwise the army itself can become a source of chaos. But even in such darkness, there remains the memory of people like Thompson, who proved that a choice is always possible. The strategy of search and destroy was one of the key tactics of the U.S. Armed forces during the Vietnam War, used from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s. It grew out of the concept of limited war and an attempt to adapt U.S. forces to the specifics of fighting the National Liberation Front, Viet Cong. This tactic involved conducting active offensive operations in rural areas where the enemy hid among the population and aimed to eliminate the enemy's human resources rather than hold or control territory. The main feature of search and destroy was that U.S. troops were tasked not with capturing and holding villages or strategic positions but with moving into suspected guerrilla zones, combing them, and eliminating any forces identified as hostile. After the operation, units withdrew, leaving the territory without permanent control. Unlike a classic campaign in which the capture and holding of populated areas are central objectives, in Vietnam the emphasis was on temporary incursions and inflicting maximum losses. A crucial element of the tactic was the system for assessing combat effectiveness. The U.S. command used the body count, the number of enemies killed, as the primary success metric. The higher the figure, the more successful the operation was deemed. This method led to significant distortions. First, soldiers and officers often inflated the numbers for reporting purposes. Second, in a guerrilla war it was nearly impossible to draw a clear line between armed Viet Cong fighters and civilians. As a result, civilians were often categorized as enemy and became victims of operations. Search and destroy was supplemented by the introduction of so-called free fire zones, areas considered under enemy control where any person present was automatically regarded as hostile. In practice, this meant artillery or airstrikes could be carried out on any target within such zones, regardless of whether it had any relation to combat. This strategy created numerous problems. On the one hand, it allowed U.S. forces to deliver certain tactical blows, destroying supply bases and camps. On the other hand, its long-term effectiveness was doubtful. The Viet Cong, with high mobility and support from sympathetic locals, quickly recovered. After U.S. units withdrew, villages again fell under guerrilla control. Moreover, search and destroy had severe humanitarian consequences. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed or wounded. Homes were destroyed, crops and food stocks wiped out. This not only worsened the humanitarian situation but also fueled local resentment. Instead of undermining support for the Viet Cong, such actions often had the opposite effect. Villagers who lost relatives or property were driven to join or assist the guerrillas. The very notion of measuring success through the body count also drew criticism. Many researchers noted that this approach turned war into statistics and tempted commanders and soldiers to view any Vietnamese as a potential enemy. This, in turn, led to tragic incidents, the most famous being the My Lai massacre of 1968. Though it became the symbol of excessive brutality, deaths of civilians during search and destroy operations occurred regularly. The American press and public learned of the scale only years later. Initially, military briefings presented search and destroy as a successful tactic that weakened enemy forces. But as publications and eyewitness accounts grew, dissatisfaction increased, and criticism mounted among scholars and military analysts. It was noted that constant raids and mass use of artillery and aviation in rural areas not only failed to bring the United States closer to victory but undermined the legitimacy of its presence in the eyes of the international community. By the early 1970s, it became clear the strategy had not justified itself. U.S. losses continued to grow, support among South Vietnam's population declined, and the Viet Cong in North Vietnam demonstrated the ability to wage a protracted war. As a result, the focus shifted to Vietnamization, transferring responsibility to the South Vietnamese army and to seeking a political settlement. Thus, search and destroy is a vivid example of how strategic decisions in a guerrilla war can produce outcomes opposite to those intended. It showed the limits of quantitative indicators for measuring success and demonstrated that ignoring humanitarian factors and local needs leads to increased resistance and the undermining of intervention goals. The repercussions influenced not only the outcome of the Vietnam War but also subsequent U.S. approaches to conflicts elsewhere. The Phoenix program was one of the most controversial initiatives undertaken by the United States and its South Vietnamese allies during the Vietnam War. Operating from 1967 to 1972, it aimed to neutralize the political and organizational infrastructure of the National Liberation Front. Unlike traditional military operations, Phoenix was primarily an intelligence operational program focused on identifying, arresting, and eliminating so-called Viet Cong cadres, those responsible for logistics, propaganda, intelligence gathering, and coordination. The program was led by the CIA in cooperation with South Vietnamese security services and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. A network of intelligence centers was established to collect information from denunciations, military intelligence reports, and interrogations of detainees. Based on this data, lists of individuals suspected of ties to the Viet Cong were compiled. These people were subject to arrest or physical elimination. The program's methods raised serious legal and moral questions. Extrajudicial measures were often used. Many arrests were accompanied by torture, cruel treatment, and killings. According to U.S. official data, over 5 years more than 80,000 people were neutralized, about 20,000 of whom were killed. Independent sources and critics claim the death toll may have been significantly higher. A key problem was unreliable information. In wartime, reports often stemmed from personal grudges, local conflicts, or residents' desire for gain. As a result, individuals with no connection to the Viet Cong ended up on lists. Arrests and executions of such people provoked resentment and strengthened popular support for the guerrillas, contradicting the program's stated goals. Phoenix received wide publicity in the United States in the late 1960s, when reports of torture, extrajudicial killings, and large-scale eliminations appeared in the press. In 1971, congressional hearings featured testimony from former program personnel. Allegations of systematic human rights violations and mass killings were voiced. Although officials claimed the aim was solely to destroy the Viet Cong's organizational network, public opinion viewed Phoenix as an instrument of terror. Despite the scandals, U.S. military leaders considered Phoenix effective in military terms. It did inflict blows on the Viet Cong structure in the south. Thousands of coordinators, couriers, and propagandists were arrested or eliminated. However, the long-term effect was limited. The NLFS network proved resilient, and vacancies were quickly filled. Moreover, the harsh methods deepened rural dissatisfaction and increased sympathy for the guerrillas, undermining U.S. and South Vietnamese political goals. By the early 1970s, the program was gradually wound down. With the reduction of U.S. presence and the shift to Vietnamization, its functions were transferred to South Vietnamese services. By 1972, its reputation was badly damaged, and Phoenix became synonymous with repression and brutality. In historiography and public consciousness, Phoenix remains one of the most contentious episodes of the war. Supporters emphasize its role in weakening the Viet Cong's organizational base and see it as a logical element of counterinsurgency. Critics point to mass human rights violations, unreliable intelligence, and destructive effects on public sentiment. Thus, Phoenix became an example of how attempts to fight an underground network through secret operations and terror can backfire, deepening distrust and hatred among rural communities and damaging the United States' international image. One of the defining features of the Vietnam War was the unprecedented scale of air power. The United States used air forces as the main instrument of pressure on North Vietnam and the guerrilla infrastructure in the south. The scale and intensity had no precedent at the time. According to the Pentagon, over the course of the conflict, U.S. aircraft dropped more than 7 million tons of munitions on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, twice as much as the Allies used in all of World War II. The main northern air campaign was Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965-1968, systematic bombardment of transportation infrastructure, industrial sites, and military bases. Its goal was to undermine North Vietnam's economic potential and force it to stop supporting the southern insurgency. The results were limited, targets were rapidly repaired, and the population rallied around resistance. Civilians suffered enormous losses from strikes on densely populated areas. At the same time, air power was used directly in the south. In rural areas, airstrikes often supported ground operations, area sweeps, and the destruction of guerrilla shelters. Napalm, a gasoline-based incendiary thickened with polymers, became the most infamous weapon. Dropped from aircraft or used from helicopters, it caused fires and burns, turning entire areas into scorched zones. Napalm use gained notoriety thanks to numerous accounts and photographs. One of the most famous symbols of the war was the image of Kim Phuc, a girl severely burned during a 1972 strike. Despite U.S. military claims that napalm was used solely against military targets, in practice its use in populated areas led to mass civilian casualties. In addition to napalm, cluster munitions, general-purpose bombs, and naval gunfire were widely used. Cluster bombs had a particularly heavy impact on rural populations. Many bomblets failed to detonate on impact, becoming delayed action mines. For decades after the war, civilians in Vietnam continued to be killed by unexploded ordnance. The U.S. Air Force and Navy also pursued a strategy of deforestation. The combination of chemical defoliants, primarily Agent Orange, and bombardment made large areas unsuitable for agriculture and destroyed traditional village life. Intended to deprive the Viet Cong of cover and food, it in reality inflicted irreparable damage on the environment and public health. The humanitarian consequences were vast. According to Vietnamese sources, millions of civilians suffered from airstrikes. Hundreds of thousands of homes were destroyed, tens of thousands of villages were partially or completely wiped out. The loss of crops and infrastructure led to hunger and mass displacement. The international community increasingly criticized the United States for methods that primarily harmed civilians. The proportionality of force became particularly contentious. Many scholars note that massive air power did not yield strategic results. North Vietnam's economy continued to function with Soviet and Chinese assistance, and the Viet Cong maintained the capacity for prolonged war. At the same time, the bombing strengthened Vietnamese resolve and complicated negotiations. U.S. officials long insisted that aviation was used in accordance with international law and targeted only military objectives. However, documentary evidence, investigative journalism, and photographs showed otherwise. From the late 1960s onward, publications about widespread village destruction and civilian deaths influenced U.S. public opinion and fueled the anti-war movement. Thus, the use of air power and incendiaries became not only a military but also a political problem. The scale of destruction, civilian casualties, and ecological damage undermined U.S. international standing and sparked intense domestic debate. Bombing, napalm, and cluster munitions became symbols of the war, perceived not as instruments of victory but as proof of its inhumanity. In sum, the air campaign did not achieve its strategic aims. While North Vietnam and the Viet Cong remained capable of resistance, air power became a leading source of civilian casualties, and napalm a lasting symbol of the war's destructive force. One of the most notorious and tragic aspects of the war was the use of chemicals. From 1961 to 1971, the United States conducted a large-scale defoliation program aimed at depriving the enemy of jungle cover and destroying the rural food base. Central to this effort was Agent Orange, one of several herbicides codenamed by drum color, Agent Blue, Agent White, Agent Orange, etc. Known as Operation Ranch Hand, the program involved spraying chemicals from planes, helicopters, and ground vehicles. Over 10 years, about 20% of South Vietnam's territory was treated. An estimated 80 million liters of defoliants were dispersed, a significant portion containing the toxic compound dioxin, a persistent environmental contaminant with strong carcinogenic and mutagenic effects. Militarily, the goal was to destroy dense tropical vegetation used for ambushes, caches, and movement, and to eliminate rice paddies and other crops so as to deprive the enemy of food. However, the consequences went far beyond military aims. Even during the war, numerous illnesses were recorded among exposed populations: skin diseases, respiratory problems, digestive disorders. Later studies showed long-term effects including cancers, birth defects, infertility, and liver damage. Dioxin accumulates in soil, water, and the human body, making exposure prolonged and intergenerational. Vietnamese sources estimate that about 4 million people were affected. Hundreds of thousands of children were born with congenital defects. The effects are still felt today. Heavily sprayed regions retain elevated contamination levels. Agent Orange became a symbol of ecological and humanitarian catastrophe. The chemical program also harmed U.S. and Allied service members. Thousands who served in spray zones were exposed to dioxin and later suffered serious illnesses: cancer, skin diseases, reproductive disorders. Veteran organizations fought for recognition and compensation for decades. Only in the 1980s-1990s did the U.S. government officially acknowledge links between certain illnesses and Vietnam service, with affected veterans receiving medical care and payments. The political and international resonance was enormous. By the late 1960s, images of scorched trees, deserted villages, and sick children appeared in the press, sparking global outrage. Critics called U.S. actions violations of the Geneva Conventions and accused it of using chemical weapons against civilians. U.S. officials insisted these were not chemical warfare agents but herbicides approved for agriculture, intended only to destroy vegetation. For global public opinion, however, the line between agricultural chemistry and weapon proved irrelevant given the human toll. After the war, the issue remained acute. Vietnam repeatedly sought compensation and international assistance to remediate the damage. In the 2000s, the U.S. and Vietnam launched joint programs to clean up the most contaminated sites, including former air bases where chemicals were stored. Still, humanitarian consequences persist to this day. Many Vietnamese families attribute illnesses and disabilities to Agent Orange exposure. In the history of 20th century warfare, Agent Orange stands as an example of ecological war, large-scale use of chemicals to alter the environment and deprive the enemy of resources. This experience showed that such methods can have devastating long-term consequences on par with weapons of mass destruction. Mistaken targets during the Vietnam War comprise a set of incidents and systemic factors in which civilians and non-military objects became the focus of armed attacks. The phenomenon was driven by limited intelligence capabilities, the nature of guerrilla warfare, organizational legal mechanisms, and human factors. Understanding these causes and consequences explains why, in one of the 20th century's most complex conflict environments, target identification errors reach tragic proportions. The enemy's character made identification particularly difficult. The Viet Cong operated in small mobile cells, used civilian clothing and local support, and fighters did not wear uniforms. Visual attribution was impossible in the field. Intelligence often relied on aerial observation, informant reports, or intercepted communications, sources with high uncertainty prone to misinterpretation when authorizing strikes. Information and analytical infrastructure was limited. Few patrols, inadequate long-term village-level reconnaissance, and hasty conclusions meant decisions were made on fragmentary data. Air and artillery support often struck coordinates obtained under poor visibility or without corroboration, increasing the risk to civilian objects. Organizational incentives and metrics, especially the body count, pressured units and commanders to display effectiveness, favoring rapid operations with minimal verification and inflating attributions of the dead as enemy combatants. Social and cultural distance, language barriers, and lack of integration with local communities compounded the problem. Reports of weapons keepers or suspicious persons could stem from personal vendettas, interfamily feuds, or economic motives, yet be treated as reliable intelligence, leading to blacklisting and subsequent detention or liquidation of innocents. Technical and tactical errors, incorrect coordinates, radio failures, confused targeting, produced strikes on wrong locations. Friendly fire incidents were common, as were nighttime raids where stress and poor lighting heightened error rates. Institutional practices such as free fire zones and mass sweeps made any presence suspect, legally easing the use of force but effectively turning civilians into automatic targets. The consequences were multifaceted. Short-term tactical successes at the price of civilian deaths brought strategic costs, greater sympathy for guerrillas, stronger recruitment, delegitimization of authorities, and a surge in anti-war sentiment abroad. Humanitarian effects included significant civilian casualties, destruction of agricultural infrastructure, mass displacement, and long-term deterioration of living conditions. Legally and morally, numerous incidents triggered inquiries and trials, yet systemic mechanisms to prevent such errors were often lacking. Limited transparency, weak accountability, and political pressure constrained reforms. The lessons for modern operations are clear: multi-layer target verification, integrating local social humanitarian intelligence, tighter rules on the use of force, transparent investigations, and command accountability, compensation and recovery measures for affected communities. Success in counterinsurgency is measured not only by enemy losses but also by public support and institutional resilience. Thus, targeting errors were not random but the product of systemic constraints, guerrilla tactics, limited intelligence, institutional incentives, and human factors. Studying them matters for historical understanding and for crafting more responsible approaches in today's operations, where minimizing harm to civilians remains paramount. The Vietnam War also revealed serious flaws in military accountability. One of the most painful issues was the attempt by commanders to hide or minimize violence against civilians. Investigations launched after the most resonant episodes showed that control mechanisms were often inadequate, and command responses limited and formal. The best-known case was My Lai, 1968. Initial reports to commanders claimed that more than 100 Viet Cong fighters were eliminated, while omitting that the vast majority of the dead were women, children, and the elderly. Senior officers accepted such reports without proper scrutiny because they matched expectations, high body counts signaling unit success. Thus, the tragedy remained hidden from the public and parts of the military leadership for more than a year. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. The reporting structure in Vietnam prioritized quantitative metrics, encouraging suppression or distortion of data. Individual incidents involving civilians were treated as operational costs or not recorded at all. Complaints from civilians through South Vietnamese administrative channels often never reached U.S. investigative bodies or were ignored. When information about My Lai began reaching the press in 1969, the command had to initiate an official investigation. The response showed how reluctant military structures were to acknowledge violations. The inquiry led by General William Pierce spent long periods merely collecting testimony without a drive to publicly evaluate actions. Only through efforts by certain officers and civilian activists did the case gain wide resonance. Ultimately, only Lieutenant William Calley stood trial, prompting criticism that a junior officer was sacrificed to preserve the senior command's reputation. Other investigations followed the same pattern. Civilian deaths from air or artillery strikes were usually deemed errors or technical failures, rarely resulting in disciplinary action. Even with evidence of violations, rules of engagement were interpreted in favor of commanders and executors, creating a precedent of de facto impunity that undermined public and international trust in U.S. claims of adherence to humanitarian law. Relations between the military and political leadership played a special role. The White House and Pentagon, facing a growing anti-war movement, sought to minimize scandals and control public opinion, which reinforced tendencies to restrict information, classify materials, and manipulate reports. Journalists covering the topic faced accusations of undermining morale or serving the enemy, yet publications and leading outlets proved decisive in informing the broader public. A key consequence was a shift in public perception of the military. Once seen as a model of discipline and humanity, the armed forces lost trust after publications about My Lai and other incidents. Society demanded greater transparency and accountability. Under this pressure, the Pentagon reformed aspects of military justice and training, placing more emphasis on international humanitarian law. Still, in the post-war period, researchers noted that the scope of investigations remained limited and most episodes of violence against civilians never received full review. Veterans spoke of an unwritten culture of silence and mutual cover that hindered exposure of violations, suggesting concealment was systemic rather than exceptional. Overall, the problem of silent commanders revealed the contradiction between military expediency and humanitarian obligations. To maintain short-term discipline and reporting, command preferred to hide facts that could provoke public outcry. In the long run, this strategy produced an even deeper crisis of trust, both domestically and abroad. The Vietnam War became one of the most destructive conflicts of the second half of the 20th century, with civilians bearing the greatest losses. Demographic studies and official reports differ in estimates of the number of dead, but all agree that civilian casualties numbered in the millions. According to the Vietnamese government, published in the 1990s, about 2 million civilians were killed during the war. Other sources provide more restrained figures, between 500,000 and 1.5 million. Differences stem from the difficulty of accounting in a guerrilla war, the destruction of infrastructure, and the lack of systematic death registration. Direct demographic losses include civilians killed by combat air and artillery strikes, punitive operations, as well as those resulting from mass displacement. The destruction of villages and farmland deprived people of food and livelihoods, forcing them to flee. As a result, millions became displaced. In South Vietnam alone, more than 5 million people are estimated to have become internally displaced, living in temporary camps or on city outskirts, creating social tension and aggravating the humanitarian crisis. Medical consequences were equally severe. The widespread use of chemicals, particularly Agent Orange, caused long-term illnesses manifested as cancers, reproductive disorders, and congenital defects. Millions were exposed to dioxin, and the effects persist to this day. Families in treated areas exhibit elevated disability rates that endure into the second and third generations. The healthcare system's collapse compounded the crisis. Hospitals and clinics were bombed, shortages of medicines and equipment became chronic. Many doctors and nurses died or left combat zones. Millions lost access to basic care. Infectious disease spread, malnutrition and unsanitary conditions in refugee camps drove high child mortality and chronic illness. The war also reshaped demographic structure. High mortality among military-age men in both North and South disrupted the gender balance and increased the number of widows. Mass deaths of children and adolescents created demographic troughs in certain regions, effects felt for decades, reducing economic potential and social stability. Trauma and psychological disorders became everyday realities. Bombings, loss of loved ones, and constant fear generated a collective trauma. Researchers note that its effects remain visible in Vietnamese society: heightened vulnerability to stress, social adaptation difficulties, and a persistent memory of the war as a key element of national identity. Thus, the price of war for civilians was paid not only in immediate losses but in long-term consequences spanning generations. Demographic ruptures, disability, chronic disease, the destruction of healthcare infrastructure, and mass displacement slowed the country's recovery for decades, turning the Vietnam War into a humanitarian catastrophe whose effects reach far beyond its historical frame. The Vietnam War, which ended in 1975, left not only political and military legacies but also profound humanitarian lessons. The mass deaths of civilians, destruction of ecosystems and infrastructure, and systemic violations of international humanitarian law became subjects of reflection in America and worldwide. The first lesson was the recognition of military power's limits in a guerrilla conflict. Despite overwhelming firepower and technology, the United States failed to achieve its strategic goals. Search and destroy, the Phoenix program, and air and chemical campaigns did not bring victory. Instead, they strengthened resistance and increased support for the Viet Cong among the population. Without accounting for social context and civilian needs, even the largest operations can prove counterproductive. A second key aspect was the development of international law and humanitarian norms. The Vietnam experience influenced further codification of the laws of war, especially the protection of civilians. Precedents related to My Lai, napalm, and Agent Orange became arguments for expanding debates on banning certain weapons and methods. A third lesson concerns transparency and accountability. Attempts to cover up war crimes, limited investigations, and shifting blame to junior officers undermine trust in military leadership. The Vietnam experience spurred stronger mechanisms of civilian control over the military in the United States and increased the role of the media as a tool of public oversight. A fourth aspect is the long-term humanitarian impact. Agent Orange and unexploded ordnance became symbols of a war whose consequences last for decades, demonstrating that weapons and methods with prolonged effects on health and the environment have repercussions far beyond military logic. Finally, memory of the war plays an important role in both Vietnam and the United States. For Vietnam, it is a national tragedy that also forms part of a narrative of resistance and victory. For the United States, it is a painful experience that generated veterans' movements, extensive scholarship, and cultural works that help make sense of mistakes. Memorials, museums, and educational programs on both sides of the ocean serve as reminders that such events must not be repeated. Thus, the final lesson of the Vietnam War is the recognition that victory cannot be measured only by enemies killed or territory seized. The true criteria are the preservation of civilian life, adherence to humanitarian norms, and a society's ability to overcome the consequences of war. This is why the memory of Vietnam continues to warn the modern world: the human cost of war is always disproportionate to any political or military aims.